Professor Sartori, thank you for this interview. We really appreciate it.
Very welcome.
You are a very well-known man in the topic of politics. From a theoretical point of view, you are a strong reference, without doubts, in the field of politics and comparative politics. And in this sense, you have studied the Mexican political system for some years now.
Well, since the 60s, really.
Since the late 60s, correct. And at that time, you coined the term hegemonic party for the PRI. Why was that?
Well, because in the literature it was considered a dictatorship.
A dictatorship?
Yes, it was big in international literature. And I said no, because dictators never resign.
Right.
And in Mexico, all of them have resigned except one, but he died. So that wasn't the problem. So a dictator that resigns is a dictator that respects the law. And then you have a small number of licensed parties, which are for the beauty of the show. But still they're there. And so this is a very atypical dictatorship. And I call it, I have classified it as a hegemonic party system. One party is hegemonic, the PRI, obviously, but other parties are permitted to exist.
Right.
And over time, they have even been given a larger share in the participation in parliament. So it's a hegemonic, pragmatic system. I say it doesn't have a great ideology. A hegemonic, pragmatic system, which, however, is moving towards more democracy, and at some point it may have to become democratic. That was the argument in the late 60s, which wasn't a bad argument. Anyhow, I said it's not a dictatorship. Dictatorships, the first principle is that dictators don't have successors. They don't resign.
They don't resign.
And that is an immense difference, because if a dictator has to die, most Mexican presidents are alive after their tenure. And if they have done very wrong things, they can be persecuted. That makes an enormous difference and keeps the brakes over them. So that at the time was quite an innovative interpretation. I think the only innovative interpretation. And for that reason, I went on following Mexico, and things basically occurred as I predicted.
Professor, you rewrote new arguments for this system in the early 90s. And you suggest in one of your main books, at least in Latin America, Ingeniería Constitucional Comparada, that Mexico was clearly in a transition to democracy. But you state at that time that that transition basically was on the electoral field, not in the constitutional field.
Yes, but I also took the position because at the time the PAN, I think, had won his first election with the, what's the name of the first?
They won the first governorship, yes, governorship, not the presidency. That was
yes,
until
but then
2000, yes.
yeah. And what's his name? I forget it. Anyhow, since the PRI for once finally lost the presidency, because the president was of PAN, not the present one, but the predecessor.
That was until 2000, yes. On the 90s.
So I said, this is the moment in which some constitutional reform can be, which is necessary, can be put forward and approved. And I recommended, at the time there was great excitement, we have to write a new constitution. I said, in my experience, new constitutions are very difficult to write, and usually they are a mess, because constitution makers, assemblies are bad constitution makers. And Mexico would, the constitution goes back to 1917.
Correct.
For the time, it was a good constitution. It became a hegemonic system out of practice, but most of the prescriptions of the Constitution were intelligent and appropriate. So I said, don't fall into the dream of writing a new Constitution. You'll never make it. And if you make it, it'll be horrible, because all new constitutions of this recent are assembly made. Mm-hmm. And assemblies cannot draft a constitution. Older constitutions were made by experts, by constitutionalists, and approved subsequently by Parliament. That was a good way to perform in constitution making. Since now we are in the 1990s, I don't think that the constitutional reform of the old kind would work.
Right.
You have basically a good constitution, or you have to touch and change some aspects, but this is a matter really of changing a few articles of the Constitution. Mm-hmm. And I said that would be feasible. At the time, I think the climate was right for doing it. The PRI at the time was had suffered its first defeat, so it was a little bit under shock, and was more accommodative, or, ready to accept reforms. Unfortunately, very little was done by the two pan presidents, mm-hmm. And the constitutions which are now still on the agenda now, the amendments, so the changes in a few articles of the Constitution, I don't think are very important. The important ones have been omitted.
So, Professor, you were saying that you think that we have a good constitution in Mexico,
basically.
And you think that it's well institutional design. But now, one of the main concerns that we do have in Mexico, and in general terms, the political system, is how to build a government with majorities, how to avoid divided governments.
Well, that's impossible, because divided governments are created by divided electorates. So if you do not have an absolute majority electorate, you will have always in Congress minority government, in the sense that the president does not control the majority. Now, in the United States, the divided government has become frequent, and the system has not been changed, really. The president sends his bill to Congress, and Congress sends it back with its pork barrel. Especially the Senate, every senator has his constituency. They want a bridge, a church, a school, so they put all this and worse in the package of the general governmental plan of the year. And the system functions because the president has what is called line
item veto.
Line and item veto, mm-hmm. which means that he can cancel all the interpositions. He may leave some, probably because it's a very powerful senator that proposes it. But in principle, he can cancel all the pork and barrel stuff that Congress sends back. And at this point, Congress has to accept, because it's not feasible in the United States to have a government which cannot pay. It's bureaucracy, it's army, etc. So this is a good system, because the members of parliament have done their duty vis-à-vis their constituencies. They have put forward the proposal. The president has cancelled them, and there's nothing I can do about that. So in general, the bill is positive.